Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Lotus Eaters. I am your host, Harry Robinson, joined today by my colleague, Thomas Dowling, one of the only people in the office that I find remotely interesting. I can only thank God that I'm not sat here across the table from John, or God forbid Josh, who's been copying my hairstyle for some time now, although mine is slightly better. Today, we're going to be talking about the classic 2000 film American Psycho, a film that at the time many dismissed as being a just generic slasher film. But I think if you dig beneath the surface, you will find that there is depth and political allegory to be found within there, and also a heartwarming tale of friendship and redemption. All right.
My name's Paul Allen.
Oh my goodness. Was it a dream the whole time? We'll find out as we get further. So let's begin.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas and I have recently rewatched the film American Psycho, which is one of my favorites. So as we go along in this discussion, I apologize if I get a little bit gushing about it, because it's such a rewatchable film, such a fun film to watch. Ironically, given the subject matter of a psychopathic Wall Street banker, well, are we entirely sure even what he does in the film? Because we never see him do any work.
No, we don't.
In the whole film. But we can only assume a Wall Street banker who decides to break from reality and start murdering prostitutes, women, his colleagues, anyone he can get his hands on at once. But yes, that is all part of the mystique of the film, because it's very, very ambiguous. And for anybody who hasn't watched it before, I'd recommend you watch it first and then come back to this, because we will be spoiling the film. So, first impressions. I know you've watched the film before, Tom, but what was the most recent viewing experience like, barring the fact that you did fall asleep because you were knackered?
Yes. Well, it very much encapsulates, I would say, the postmodern condition in every single way, which of course is very fitting given that the novel was originally a postmodern novel. Of course, the director's presentation of it is not, seems to be indicates withdrawal from it, but the film is very much consistent with the philosophical content of the novel.
Yes, that was one of the interesting things. Reading, in preparation for this, I watched a number of interviews, and I'd always been under the preconception that the writer of the original book, because for those who don't know, this film is based on the novel American Psycho by the author Bret Easton Ellis. I thought that he wasn't particularly happy with the film. I thought that he thought it wasn't a particularly faithful adaptation, but upon watching interviews, reading interviews with him, although he is one of those kind of guys who's a little bit cheeky, doesn't like to be entirely honest with everything that he is saying, he does overall seem to give the impression that he really enjoyed the film and he thought it was a good adaptation, even if he would have done things differently. And what you're talking about with the postmodern nature of it is I would assume, the ambiguity.
Yes, I would say it works very, very well as a criticism of modernity, postmodernity, capitalism, and neoliberalism all at the same time.
You could certainly put that argument forward, and I'll be interested to see what references that you have for that. But on the basis of postmodern art, people can have whatever opinions they want about, postmodernism and such. And I'm certainly not a huge fan of the philosophy itself, but I am a big fan of postmodern art. I think in and of itself, it can create very striking and engaging art in the first place. And also the ambiguity that a lot of it rests within, because my favorite director is David Lynch. I'm a big fan of his work and stuff like Twin Peaks, which we will hopefully end up having a discussion about eventually.
Absolutely.
Is very much part of the audience participation of it, is that it leaves enough respect for the viewer to let you make up your own mind about some of the events that happen. And this film in particular is very, very skittish about what's true and what's false.
Well, the vulgarity of postmodernism itself, I think, is so brilliantly captured in this film, and that's what makes it so important, I think.
What references would you bring to support that claim?
Youth courses themselves that matter. It's the fact that he's transmitting the sign. All they can actually, I can't remember his name, but the one who turns out to be gay responds by saying,
Lewis Carruthers.
What a lovely thing to say.
How thought-provoking.
And that is precisely where we are now with the woke zeitgeist. It attaches less value to what you actually do for justice per se. When, of course, in some cases there is a legitimate case for people raising social injustices, but you look at the way Hollywood behaves.
Yes,
it is all performative imagery, and there are endless examples whereby people are caught out being disingenuous in actually transmitting virtue signals, but actually are completely held unaccountable because the media attaches more value to the narrative
Absolutely.
than to the cause itself.
I would agree with that assessment entirely, to be honest. For context, the film obviously follows Patrick Bateman, played brilliantly by Christian Bale, who is the eponymous American psycho who begins snapping and going crazy and trying to kill.
It's not the work that matters.
Yes,
it's the image
exactly.
of work that matters.
Exactly, and the whole thing is that whenever he's out in public, socializing with all of his friends and all of their friends, the whole thing is a status game where they're trying to basically proto-virtue signal to one another about the fact that they care about all of the important topics. Of Patrick's immediate circle of friends, he only seems to have one person who is willing and able to call anybody out on this BS, which is his friend Bryce, who, despite still being in the same circle, seems to at least have a layer of cynicism over it where he can recognize that what Patrick's doing is false. Because one of the first scenes that you see is them all in a club talking about various issues, and Patrick goes on this long spiel about how we need to protect the environment, we need to fight for women's rights, we need to end apartheid. And Patrick, because we know what kind of person he is reasonably, does not care about any of these things at all. On the inside, he is hollow and empty. He says as much in the narration that he does not feel emotions.
He's literally not a person.
Yeah,
I would argue, and I would say that applies to pretty much all of them. Even the cynicism expressed by Bryce is not a response of coming from a person. That's a response coming from someone who's acting in accordance to social signifiers as Patrick Bateman, but in competition with laying claim.
Yes, I would suppose in terms of the competitive nature of like all of these people. When I say Patrick's circle of friends, I should probably say the circle of people he hates least that he works with, because none of these people have any true connection or deeper meaning to one another. Although Patrick does say in the narration that Bryce is the only person that he finds interesting, probably purely because of the fact that he doesn't seem to follow the herd as much as everybody else does.
That actually might be a correct assessment, because if Bryce was, for example, to opt out of this complete fungibility, he's no longer in the same game as Patrick Bateman. So Patrick Bateman could concede and say, this is an authentic person, and for that reason, he's not a threat to me.
Yes, potentially. Yeah. You can see that
he is an abstraction, a self-described abstraction.
But yeah, let's get into a bit of the context of the film as well. So as I said, it's based on the novel by Bret Easton Ellis. It's directed by Mary Harron, who is a director. I'm only really familiar with this particular work. She's apparently done another film with the co-writer of the film called Guinevere Turner, called The Notorious Betty Page, that I'm not really aware of. And one of the things that many people point to nowadays, because this is a film that's really appreciated by a lot of people, but in a sort of bipartisan way. People on the left and right enjoy it, but those on the left and even some of those on the right do sort of point to it as a kind of feminist film, which is kind of a move supported by the director Mary Harron herself in interviews that I've watched. She considered it a feminist work. Bret Easton Ellis considered the original novel, which, by the way, I don't think you've read it.
No.
I've not read it either, so we're only going to be mentioning the novel in reference to the film because I've not read it. But Bret Easton Ellis was also saying that he considered parts of the book a takedown of certain masculine tropes. And I don't know if I would necessarily agree that it's a feminist film.
No.
Primarily because I see it as a broader satire. Because I do view this film primarily as a satirical black comedy with thriller elements mixed in there. I do think it's absolutely hilarious for the most part of the film.
It's hysterical in places.
Yeah, but I see it as the satire of that Wall Street culture rather than purely toxic masculinity or whatever you want to put it on.
And they're not presented really as... Well, you could say some of the characters are presented as victims in the film, but they're not presented as victims in virtue of them being women. They're presented as victims in virtue of them being acting like people, such as his. Again, I'm terrible with names.
Seeing is, depending on how you interpret the scenes that we see throughout the film, almost got her killed.
Yeah, and there are, of course, misogynistic elements in Patrick's behaviour. What is the root of that? Is he actually acting in accordance to the toxic masculinity that the feminists point to, or is he actually doing this to stay in character, if you like?
One of the interesting things is that it seems that he seems to think, because Patrick is not a normal person. Obviously, he's a complete psychopath. and he seems to find it completely normal. He's like an alien that's been dropped into Earth, as has been described by the director. Like an alien that's been dropped onto Earth and decided to try and learn how to interact with people through watching horror films and porn. Because that's when you see scenes of him living at his flat, that's all you see him watching.
He is just an expression of the discourse he happens to be in. That is the quintessential postmodern self.
But he does seem to be, in terms of actual interests that he has that he isn't putting on for the performance that he's putting for other people, he seems to be obsessed with serial killers. He casually brings up Ed Gein. What did Ed Gein say about
his toxic masculinity and how much is actually just veering into absolute chaos without or just a world without any sense of order at all?
Well, I do think...
Because let's not forget what the essence of postmodernism is, the breaking down of binaries. The only result of the breaking down of binaries is the complete unravelling of everything we've come to value. Well, that leaves you ultimately to retreat in, you could say, primitive instincts that would, of course, come into force should you completely do away with the meaning of the things that keep you civilized. You could say that the fantasies that he engages in is an expression of that, but is that an explicitly masculine thing to actually be without order? I would argue that if anything is surely is a pro-masculine message.
Well, what we were talking about before the cameras came on was the idea that the whole idea of masculinity in the film is questionable, primarily because there is a lot of feminine aspects to the behaviour of all of these men, where everything is a status game, everything is competition.
Well, the biggest refutation of the feminist charge, you could say, is that how masculine are these men, really?
Not particularly.
No.
I mean, there are elements for men to being you're very muscular. It's often remarked that most of the time other men are the ones who are most impressed with a big male physique.
He's not doing that to go hunting or to, I don't know, compete in the Olympics. He's doing that to be on display in the same way that women, of course, present themselves as being on display, and hence the value they attach to makeup even today. That is quite literally the collapsing of masculinity into femininity, isn't it?
Yes, I think what you could describe it as, and what I would sort of think about this, is that it's the traditionally certain masculine traits of competition, constantly being, competing with one another, especially all the men around him, is those instincts put into a position completely removed from the situations wherein those traits evolved. So they're still trying to outcompete one another. Everything is still a status game, but because of this layer, this skin suit of civility they have to wear at all times because of the uptown, fancy, exclusive scenarios and places they find themselves, has sort of deformed itself. That masculine urge to outperform the other is no longer a case of physical impressiveness, is no longer a case of you have to outcompete in some kind of physical display of excellence. It's all about who can be the biggest virtue signaler, who can have the nicest suit, who can have the nicest
Capital
haircut.
has moved to social and symbolic value.
Yes, it's symbolic, you're right there. So you could make that argument that is an aspect of masculinity, but it has, in a sense, become feminized because it's all about reputation destruction. And Patrick in particular, given what we hear about him from what other people say, because one of the interesting things about this film is that everybody who interacts with Patrick never seems to realize that he is Patrick. They're constantly mistaking him for other people, probably because within the context of the film, all of these people are basically interchangeable suits.
Yes.
None of these people have defined or distinctive personalities, except for Patrick.
Goes out with that loser Patrick Bateman. What a dork.
He doesn't seem to have the best reputation. Even among these slimy Wall Street types, people seem to see him as this weak, dithering, pitiable...
Such a dork. Such a boring, spineless lightweight.
He does not seem to have the best reputation.
Is that, and I guess that this is easily falsifiable, I suppose. But could that be an expression of what's going on in his mind? Or an ongoing inferiority complex that isn't maybe true?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.